critical mass. So I am going to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dora Rose, and I am the Deputy Director with the League of Women Voters of California, and our Chief Legislative Advocate here. Thank you all for being here. It's a big crowd today, and we're delighted that you came out for this. Just a few housekeeping matters. Please put any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we will address them at the end. We are recording, and we're also going to email both the recording and links for materials and sources that we reference along the way. So as you hear us, talking about various sources and materials, don't worry, you will get an emailed link to that. In a moment, I am going to introduce our esteemed panel. You see folks here. But before I do that introduction, I do want to quickly set the stage for this webinar because California's got a problem, right? Despite the fact that we're a very diverse state where people of color make up a majority of our population and where many laws have been passed to, remove voting impediments and to promote access, there continues to be significant disparities in voting participation among youth and voters of color compared to our older non-Hispanic white population, right? And there's also evidence that you're going to hear about the public awareness of new opportunities to participate in democracies really lacking. We haven't managed to get the word out well. And that many people do not know how to access basic information like where to vote in person or how to ensure that your mail ballot's actually going to get counted. And what all of this means is that decisions about critical issues of local and statewide importance are being made by a predominantly older, white, and a profoundly unrepresentative electorate. So we have a big democracy problem in California, despite the fact that you may think of us as sort of on the cutting edge of democracy reforms. So a lot of the work that the League of Women Voters does in California from both an advocacy and also an educational perspective is designed to tackle the problem and to shrink that participation gap. And so today you're going to hear from some of our partners in that fight. We have a very illustrious crew. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to be presenting. You'll excuse the long introductions, but I really do want to make sure that you know a little bit about all of them. Phyllis, I see you have your hand raised. Can you put your question in the Q&A? We will take questions at the end. The first person I want to introduce is going to be our first presenter. I'm delighted to have Dr. Mindy Romero here with us today. And thank you for highlighting her, Savannah, to present data and analysis on the issues. Dr. Romero is the founder and the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the University of Southern California. She's a political sociologist who does research focusing on political behavior and race and ethnicity. And she seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and actually across the United States. You may recognize Dr. Romero's name or her voice once she gets to start talking, because she's spoken and written about civic engagement in numerous venues, including testifying before the National Commission on Voting Rights and also in the California legislature quite frequently, and appearing also as a frequent guest on National Public Radio and affiliate stations. Dr. Romero's research has often also been cited in major news outlets. She's a star in the field. In 2023, she was named to the National Academy of Public Administration's class of Academy Fellows for the 2023 class. And in 2018, the McClatchy News named her a California influencer, one of a group of 60 thought leaders in the state. And then I'm likewise thrilled to introduce Pablo Rodriguez. We can highlight Pablo, the founding executive director of Communities for a New California Education Fund. So Pablo leads a really dynamic team of 14 full-time staff and over 40 year-round canvassers who are working out of offices across Sacramento, Merced, Fresno, Hanford, and the Coachella Valley. Under his leadership, CNC's civic engagement programs have reached over 600,000 voters across 17 counties in the San Joaquin Valley, Coachella Valley, and Sierra foothills, really building power through sustained nonpartisan voter outreach and leadership development. Now, before launching CNC, Pablo worked in political strategy and communications at the federal level with a focus on voters of color. He also directed, if that wasn't enough, the Dolores Huerta Community Organizing Institute and developed innovative service learning and microfinance programs with institutions like San Jose State and Loyola Marymount University, where he actually helped create the first U.S. microfinance initiative that was focused on farm workers. Then after Pablo, we have, we're going to hear from Jayla Ashan Abner, who's going to talk specifically about AB 868, which is a very exciting bill authored by Assemblymember Juan Carrillo that our organizations are sponsoring. As a voting rights program associate at Common Cause California, Jayla leads coalition efforts to push for election reforms, to expand voter protections, to strengthen civic engagement across the state. With a master in public policy from UCLA and a bachelor's in economics from Spelman, Jayla combines data-driven analysis with hands-on advocacy. She has worked with organizations like End Poverty in California to tackle intergenerational poverty and wealth inequality, and she's also contributed to economic research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And finally, last but certainly not least, you're going to hear from Skye Allen. Hi, Skye. Skye is the executive director of Inland Empire United. She got her start in the field as a policy fellow with the Warehouse Worker Resource Center before working as IE United's program director. When she was program director, Skye managed the table's census outreach, redistricting advocacy, the Justice Leadership Academy pipeline, and also electoral field campaigns. Skye graduated from UC Riverside with a BS in business management and a minor in ethnic studies, and then she earned her master's of public policy at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs in 2023. Welcome, everybody. I am very excited to have you all here, and we are going to now get started with Mindy Romero.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here this evening. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and first share my slides. Someone can kindly tell me if you can see them. Yes, we're good. All right, then I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So tonight I'm going to talk about the state of California's electoral participation. Let me move this video so I can see a little bit better. All right. But to start, just talking about our democracy overall, participation in it is low and disparate. So whether we're talking about electoral participation, general other forms of political participation or civic engagement, we know that the proportions of U.S. Residents and Californians, right, that actually do engage are low, particularly if we compare to other established democracies around the world. And they're disparate. And disparate, we mean here that the population of those that are participating does not represent the overall U.S. population, its demographic makeup. Here in California, we do not have a representative voting electorate in any given election, whether it's high turnout or low turnout. We know that when we look at the pie of voters, those actually casting a ballot in that election, that it is not going to be representative of the California population, but not representative also of the actual eligible voter population. So those that are overrepresented are older voters, voters with higher income, and white voters. And voters of color and younger people, for instance, are underrepresented compared to the proportions of the population. Again, this is consistent across elections. And today I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about data challenges, just as that is very relevant in terms of the type of data that we're able to discuss and what we have when we're having conversations like this today about disparities. I will then present to you a lot of data on voter turnout that we do have that is still quite significant, and then talk about the reasons for disparate turnout, which are quite important, obviously. When we talk about the numbers, we have to talk about why. So just briefly here, because of time, and I'm happy to answer any methods questions if you have them in the Q&A, but if we want to see a multiracial and inclusive democracy in our state, it requires inclusive, reliable data. And we have sources that are quite limited that are available to us as researchers when we're trying to examine turnout. So two main sources are the current population survey, which is a product of the US Census. It surveys people every November about their level of engagement or voting, whether they voted in that election. And we have the California official voter file of the 22 million registered voters and their voter history. The current population survey does have long understood to have methodological challenges for identifying voters of color. It's also a survey, and it's really in California only usable for most analyses at the state level. When you want to do a sub-state analysis, get into our big, great state, look at turnout by county, by congressional district, by neighborhood, you'll have to use the California voter file. And that only has a small proportion of the file that actually has self-reported race or ethnicity, where we have the information of voters' race or ethnicity. And so researchers have to commonly use methods outside of the voter file to identify somebody's race or ethnicity. We can do that, but it's only reliable, accurate, responsible, really, for some groups and not for others, for larger population groups, but not for smaller population groups. And we want to make sure, obviously, that we are presenting data that is accurate. This is researchers in general in this field. So what we thus have, in short, is a very limited set of voter turnout research that is published in our state and across our country. And that, again, impacts the types of conversations we have, the inclusivity of the conversations that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and present to you turnout data that we do have, which is still quite significant in California, and talk about the disparities that we see at play here. But first, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about turnout, there's two main ways, very common ways that we measure turnout. One is registered voter turnout, which is simply the percent of those who are registered who actually turned out to vote. And the other is eligible voter turnout, which is the percent of those who are eligible to vote. And that here defined as adult citizens who actually turned out to vote. Both measures, again, very commonly used, reported by the Secretary of State, for instance, after every election. But there are challenges to both, the reasons why you would want to use one versus the other at times. At CID, we often emphasize that wherever possible, that people really should use the measure eligible voter turnout. One reason is because we have pretty significant disparities still in California when it comes to registration rates. If you didn't know, happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So registration rates vary by race, ethnicity, by age, by other statuses. And so when you look at registered voter turnout, you're not capturing the beginning, the starting point the differing starting point that everybody's at in terms of registration rates. And if you want to understand capacity, voice, representation across groups or put groups in relationship to each other, you'll want to look at eligible voter turnout whenever possible. So I'm going to show you a brand new 2024 voter turnout analysis, a study that we're still conducting at CID right now. The reports on these data will not come out until about May and June, but I would feel remiss if I didn't present you these data on the most recent election because of the conversation that we're having tonight. I want to note to you, though, I'm going to show you both registered this time around, as well as eligible voter turnout. In part because we're still conducting our eligible voter turnout analysis, and I have more groups that I can talk to you about by presenting registered voter turnout, if that makes sense. All right. So what was the voter turnout rate in California's November election, that 2024 general presidential election? I'm going to show you both measures here. So registered voter turnout was 70.1%. Again, turnout, or the percentage of those who registered that actually voted. And then eligible voter turnout, the percentage of those who were eligible to vote, adult citizens who turned out, 62%. And what I should note here is our number is a little bit higher for eligible voter turnout than what is officially reported by the Secretary of State's office. This last election, they reported 59, almost 60% eligible for turnout, and ours is 62%. And I'm going to talk in a moment why that is the case and why I'm noting it. But first, let's talk about how 2024 stacked up against 2020. So 2020, of course, is the most recent comparable election. We want to look at presidential to presidential, general to general. How did we do this last general election compared to 2020? And the story is decline. So we had overall lower turnout, no matter how you measure it, 10 percentage point decline in registered voter turnout rate. So in 2020, we were at about 80% registered voter turnout rate. And as you just saw, we're at about 70.1% registered voter turnout rate. So a decline of 10 percentage points. And of course, for many, right, 2024 was an enormously consequential election. Every election is, but just like 2020. But we saw significant declines. If you didn't know, 2020 was a high water mark in the US period for turnout. It was a national record for eligible voter turnout. And in California, it wasn't a record, but it was the highest eligible turnout that we've seen in decades. So how did we do in terms of eligible voter turnout? CID's calculation is that we had a decline of about 5%, 4.8, 5 percentage points from 2020 to 2024. And I note here there's an asterisk, because why is there an asterisk? I never put asterisks on my slides. It's because if you look at the official eligible voter turnout rate and reported by the Secretary of State for both elections, you'll see a much larger gap if you do the math. And it's 11 percentage point gap or change, decline from 2020 again to 2024 for eligible voter turnout rate. And we think the reason why that's happened is in the last few election cycles, we've noticed a difference, a much larger than normal difference in the Secretary of State's estimate of the number of eligible to vote Californians, different from other common sources of adult citizen data in the state. For instance, sources from the US Elections Project, which does account for those who are incarcerated, or even sources from the American Community Survey, product of the census. And so if we look at just the US Elections Project, about 800,000 fewer Californians, the Secretary of State in their estimates show 800,000 fewer eligible Californians in 2020 and about 900,000 more in 2024, which of course is just 4 years later. So we certainly aren't disputing that. Different estimates, right? People use just different estimates for different reasons. But when you have a smaller denominator in one election and you have a larger denominator in another election, it can impact the change, right, between elections. And in this case, we see 11 percentage point gap from the Secretary of State's office. So for this presentation, of course, we're showing you CID's calculation, and that is 5 percentage point decline. And if you're curious, I think the Public Policy Institute of California put out a blog a few months ago, and they had estimated about a 6 percentage point decline. So also much different. So just pointing that out. All right. So let's now talk about, in detail, registered turnout by group. So this is by race ethnicity to start. On the far right, you see that 70.1% that I showed you a little while ago for the whole state. Again, 2024 general election. And you'll see here by race ethnicity, there are quite significant differences. Again, we know that there are differences in registration rates to get to this population. But even here, we see differences. 80% registered voter turnout rate for whites, 60 almost for Latinos, 65 for Black, 67, 68 almost for Asian American. Depending on how you look at this, right, 13 to 20 percentage points lower than white voters. So significant differences here in registered voter turnout. Now we look by age. We see some differences, of course, by age. This curve you see here going from younger cohorts to older cohorts is very common. We see it in every election. It just depends exactly how high, right, the turnout is. So from about 58% for 18 to 24-year-olds to over 80% for 65 plus. Now I'm going to start going faster through some of these slides. I'm happy to go back during the Q&A if there's any questions, and we'll make these slides available so you can look at these later and certainly see and think and maybe have conversations around much more than what I'm just highlighting. There's a lot. Oh, hello. 1 second. Everybody see that? That was weird.
Why so
Very
low?
weird.
What can be done?
Oh, that's really weird. Okay, I don't know what's happening, but hold on. I'm gonna reshare. Let's see if we just reset it, because it's just freaking out. Oh no. Okay, I'm gonna do it in this mode. Can everybody see it in this mode?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll just go like that. All right. Let me move this down. My apologies. I have no idea why that happened. All right, so age. There we go. Party affiliation. So Republicans, and this is something we've seen for a very long time here in California, in case you're wondering. But again, in 2024, Republican turnout was higher than Democratic turnout by about 3.5 percentage points. And this, of course, we don't know how people actually voted. I should note that. This is how people are affiliated in their registration record. And so those that were affiliated no party preference or other party other than Democrat, Republican, much lower registered voter turnout rate. By gender, yes, women turn out in higher percentages than men, and we've seen this across the country for decades. Very much the case here in California. Again, although if you're interested, CID recently put out a report breaking out the women's vote by race, ethnicity, and there's some really interesting and different patterns by race, ethnicity. So for women of color. All right. Eligible turnout by group. So now we're going to turn to this measure. Again, this is the percentage of those who are eligible to vote, adult citizens who actually turned out. And in race ethnicity here, for accuracy and reliability purposes, we are limited right now for Latino and Asian American. But I want to show you again, for this measure, you'll remember that the eligible voter turnout rate for everybody in California in 2024 was 62%, right? Same number I've been showing you. For Latino, it's 46%, much lower. And for Asian American, also lower at 54%. Now I'm going to show you some data by county. And I'm just going to note here at first that in 2024, 29 out of our 58 counties in California administered elections under the VCA Voters' Choice Act. That equated to about 78% of the state's registered voter population. And that's because out of those 29 counties, several of them were very large counties like LA and Orange. So here, the next 3 slides are showing you eligible voter turnout by group at the county level. We're using the same scale across counties, the same colors mean the same percentages. And what I want to emphasize is I've just been showing you state level data. Well, of course, at the county level, some counties are higher and some counties are lower in turnout than the state averages. And by the way, this, of course, is the case for a sub-county level too. But here you'll see eligible voter turnout differing across the state to some degree. If we look at Latino, again, same scale, same colors, you'll see first off, the big thing to note is that, of course, almost every county is at the lower end, or every county is at the lower end of the scale, and then turnout even lower in Southern California, sorry, in the Central Valley and in the North State. And then Asian American, more of a patchwork quilt, but we see some counties higher than the state average and some counties lower than the state average for Asian American. So to recap here, and then I'm going to talk about reasons for disparate turnout. Again, participation gaps widened in 2024. The one thing I haven't talked about because of time, but just briefly, I should note that, of course, turnout is much lower in midterm elections and even lower in primary elections. And the disparities by group of course, usually almost always tend to be even more significant and larger. So there are consequences, as I think Dora was referencing earlier. Why does it matter about participation gaps, right? It matters because hopefully we want to see a fully robust democracy where everybody's participating in our elected representatives are hearing from everybody, but it has consequences for real policy decisions and outcomes, right, in communities, because our decision makers are not hearing from everyone about their full slate of needs and interests. Let's talk about reasons for disparate turnout. So why so low and what can be done? And I know my colleagues that are going to be presenting in just a moment will be talking a lot about both of this, I think particularly about what can be done. But I want to make sure that before I leave you, that I at least note a few reasons that are commonly understood in the research for why we see lower turnout. The takeaway here is not that we see lower turnout because voters of color or younger voters, for instance, are apathetic, right? Or they don't care, or there's something inherent about these groups in terms of why they participate at lower levels. That is not the case. Those are common excuses that are used to justify often lower mobilization investment or investment by our civic structures. That's not the case. So we know that first off, and I'm just going to touch on these very quickly because of time. I mentioned already one of them, that we have significant disparities in registration still. As our registration rates have increased in the country and certainly here in California for a number of reasons, almost every group has increased as well, but we still see very significant disparities across groups by race, ethnicity, and age. And the gap story is pretty much still the same in terms of registration rates. Disparities in outreach and mobilization is a big one. So Our campaigns and our candidates do the overwhelming majority of the outreach and voter mobilization and asking people to participate in our system. And they don't reach out to everybody. They reach out in very targeted, modeled ways. And the bottom line here is that whole swaths of our electorate, particularly voters of color and young voters, receive very little outreach and mobilization, even when they are registered to vote. And then, of course, there are historic and current levels of disconnection from the political process. And then demographics. What do I mean by that? Voters of color can often find themselves, or voters that are less likely to vote, period, can often find themselves in multiple categories that predict low turnout. So for instance, a young Latino who also is going to be statistically more likely to be lower income finds themselves in 3 categories that predict low turnout, which means there's kind of a compounding of challenges. And it's even more important, right, to receive that outreach, that mobilization, that support to transition into voting. And then, as I already mentioned here, lower turnout in midterms and primaries. So I assume we're keeping questions towards the end if I did miss that. So thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to my colleague. And again, sorry for the technical issue.
Fine. And we have Pablo up next.
Yes, good evening, everybody. We'll give a moment for my presentation to load. Here we go. So the next slide. Again, my name is Pablo Rodriguez. I'm the founding executive director of Communities for a New California. Where we're going to start is a continuation of Dr. Romero's presentation. For us, what we are doing is asking ourselves, what is the reason why these things are true, right, in regards to lower voter turnout? So one of the questions that we've been asking in our surveys and our voter engagement, but also statewide surveys is, regardless or no matter how frequently you vote in elections, how much power do you feel that your vote has to change the things that matter to you? We also believe strongly that this is a link to predict voter turnout, right? So we use this to segment voters that it is that we follow up with. And you see significantly that there's 38% of voters who feel that their vote does not have any power. And there's a lot of voters in the middle who feel that they're neutral on the issue, right? So this will be a theme throughout this presentation. Next slide, please. Again, Dr. Romero referenced this. This is a table that you can actually see, or a chart that you can see of voter turnout based on party affiliation, including independent voters that have turned out significantly lower at significantly lower rates than those voters that are affiliated with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, right? And so you see those numbers continue over the last 20 years, which I feel very strongly is a significant reason why there's a drag in voter participation in elections. And next slide, please. This is the most important slide that you're going to see from me tonight. This is really important because you see that over the last 2 decades, 18 to 34-year-old Latino voters have outpaced other age cohorts in no party preference or independent voter registration. So in the last 20 years, you can see the through line that has skyrocketed, so that today, 45% of all no party preference voters are Latinos 18 to 34 years of age, which in total are 700,000 voters. I'll let everybody marinate on that and the implications for not addressing or not engaging those voters. Next slide, please. As a result of this, we asked ourselves at Communities for New California, what will we do? And so we launched the Lucete Latina campaign. The Lucete Latina campaign highlights how California and Latina women's future, success, and prosperity are inseparable, right? And so you see on the image before, on the side, it says, si no dices lo que piensas, ¿pa qué piensas? The translation is, if you don't say what you think, why think? Next slide, please. For folks, again, this presentation will be shared by video, but if you want to take a moment and click into the QR code, this takes us into our digital and our print media, where we work to highlight Latina women across California that are doing the work across an array of issues addressing issues that are impacting their families and their loved ones in their neighborhoods. I'll give a moment for that slide. Okay, next slide, please. So as a result of the 2020 census and redistricting, what we have seen is that 16 of 52 congressional districts in California are now Latino majority. 10 of the 40 state Senate and 22 of 80 state assembly districts are Latino majority. However, next slide, please. When you hear Latino majority, please think Latina voting power. There are 3.2 million registered Latina voters in California. That's 1 of every 6 voters in California. If you break this down into districts, right, where Sky Allen, the next speaker, works, forgive me, I'm doing this wrong. 1 of every 5 voters in the San Joaquin Valley, from Sacramento to Kern County, is 505,000 is a Latina voter. 1 of every 4 in the North Valley, that's Madera County up to San Joaquin County, is a Latina woman. 1 in every 3, which is Kings, Tulare, Kern, is a Latina voter. We see the impact of elections that are happening in the House of Representatives that are often decided by less than 8,000 votes. So these numbers are really significant, especially when you combine them with the impact of no party preference voters. Next slide, please. There has been significant growth of Latina voters in the last 10 years. The Latina citizen voting age population grew by 52%, or by nearly 220,000 voters in the last 10 years. This should be an alarm for any candidate, any organization, anybody, right? When they're doing their program design, to center Latina women as a part of their campaigns. Next slide, please. There's a lot of noise nationally talking about how in the voting behavior of Latino men, but I believe strongly that that's noise. The signal here is Latina women, as Latina women outpace men in voter registration and participation. And the way that it is that we broke this down is by the current California battleground districts that have received a lot of attention since redistricting this last election, and then leading into the midterm elections next year. Next slide, please. Latina women outvote Latino men in every California battleground district by a significant number. Again, as anybody that is listening to this presentation that works with organizations, candidates, is a donor, I would encourage you all to ask those that you are supporting how it is that they're centering Latina women in their work. Next slide, please. There's still opportunity for growth. Obviously, we know that we can follow the lead of women broadly, right, in how they have higher participation rates, as Dr. Romero's studies have shown. There's a significant opportunity, even with the data that it is that I just showed, of growth for Latina women to have even higher participation. Dr. Romero also mentioned, right, that candidates significantly are the ones that do the field outreach. However, what I would say, and Sky Allen and I participated in the California Battleground, or the Battleground California Coalition that addressed, that worked in the battleground districts. We had walls down meeting after the election this last November, and I could not begin to tell you how stunned I was by the significantly small amount of money that was spent by candidates on field. And with all respect to Congressman Whitesides in Congressional District 27, he raised over $12 million for his successful campaign to flip that district. But when asked what percentage of his budget went to field, to door-to-door canvassing, to phone banking, the answer was 0. They relied on volunteers coming in from Los Angeles and other places to be their field, which is just stunning to me, given that they raised $12 million. Next slide, please. Again, in the past 2 decades, the percentage of registered Latino Democrats and Republicans has decreased, while no party preference has increased. Same story, right? Or same trend. Next slide, please. In the past 2 decades, the percentage of registered no party preference voters has increased by 22%. You have to ask yourself, what is it that's happening, right? The next slide, please. And these numbers are significant given, again, that these races are often decided by less than 8,000 votes. In Congressional District 13, that race was decided by 187 votes. So you see, the numbers are in the tens of thousands. And broadly, we can say that when we've surveyed no party preference voters and had focus groups, a really big thing that they talk about is that they don't feel that they have a political home. They don't feel, especially in this last election, that candidates and organizations really addressed issues that they're struggling with, right? Inflation, housing, and healthcare. And so as a result, well, we saw what it is, that there was lower participation and lower turnout broadly. And this is just, I'm painting with a broad brush here, right? The next slide, please. We're going into a midterm election, as Dr. Romero mentioned. I'd like for you to all pay attention to Congressional Districts 13 and 22, where you see significantly lower voter turnout by no party preference voters, which are reflected in green, as compared to Republican and Democratic voter turnout. That no party preference voters have the ability to decide these congressional elections and who is in power at the United States House of Representatives. Next slide, please. I included this, including in a case study, Assembly District 27, which is nested inside of Congressional District 13, which is in the North San Joaquin Valley. Assembly member Esmeralda Soria won her race by nearly 11,000 votes. Next slide, please. This is a better view of the district, so you can see how it's nested within. Next slide, please. But you see that now Congressman David Valadao won by 187 votes. What is the reason why Assemblymember Esmeralda Soria, addressing or engaging significantly the same geography of voters, did so much better than Congressman Adam Gray? That's a question that it is that we need to ask. I have my own suspicions, right? One of them is being that she's a better candidate, but a big one being that she actually runs a stronger field campaign. Next slide, please. Congressional District 22, you see the same thing. I already mentioned it. Very small percentage of the campaign went to field and engaging voters and earning their vote. And again, Rudy Salas unfortunately lost by 11,000 votes. Next slide, please. For those of you that would like to, we've written a case study. This wasn't the first election cycle where Esmeralda Soria outperformed Adam Gray. We did a case study from the 2022 election. You can scan it here to be able to see the results of our case study. For those of us that work in this field, there's no secret sauce. There's no silver bullet. It is all the fundamentals of organizing. That's all the fundamentals of earning people's votes. And next slide, please. So we again finish with the Lucete Latina campaign. We feel very strongly that when we engage Latina voters that are the highest propensity voters in their household, we will be able to encourage them to ensure that their partners in their home vote, and if they have children, that they also vote. But it's important to note that in the San Joaquin Valley, the average Latina voter is only 32 years of age. So she has still maybe not have kids that are voting age, and there's still a long, high ceiling that it is that she can reach. Next slide, please. And again, that is the end of my presentation. And we feel again very strongly that how the success of women of Latina voters is, right? The Latino women's future success and the success of California are inseparable. Thank you.
And you can drop any questions that you have for Pablo in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end. And our next presenter is Jayla Abner. And I'll let you get your slides up and take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to have Savannah share my slides, please. Thank you. Okay, so again, I'm Jayla Abner. I'm here on behalf of California Common Cause, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to specifically focus in on AB 868, which is an important piece of legislation that will help us create a more inclusive, equitable, and representative democracy throughout the state. So briefly, I'll be touching at a high level on historical challenges around voter disenfranchisement. I think that's been like a resounding theme through some of these conversations. I'll also be talking about disparities that we observe within the primary election turnout rates. And then I'll also be, again, zeroing in on the bill AB 868, which is a necessary reform to ensure that more voters have the ability to give their vote on electing county officials. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I don't know why it was giving presenter view. One moment.
No worries. No worries.
Try that again. How about now?
Or we can, oh, okay. Yeah.
It's working.
Thank you, Savannah. So on the next slide, I just want to kind of set the tone of stating that, and I think Mindy pointed to this as well, that to understand why voter participation is unequal, we must first recognize historical barriers that have excluded entire communities from the electoral process. For generations, systemic disenfranchisement has affected BIPOC communities as well as young voters, low-income individuals, and women, amongst many more marginalized communities. And these barriers, whether through poll taxes, literacy tests, language access challenges, or even structural inequalities at large, have had long-term impacts. Even today, these disparities persist, and voter turnout remains significantly lower amongst communities of color when compared to white voters, and participation rates remain unequal due to socioeconomic factors. And so on the next slide, we're going to talk about how this shows up in California's elections today. So zeroing in on the 2022 California primary election, 7.2 million voters participated, but as you all can see, participation was far from equal when we look at racial and age groups. White voters made up 53.5% of ballots cast. Latino voters, the state's largest ethnic group, accounted for just 20.5% of votes. Asian American and Pacific Islander voters made up 15.3% of the ballots cast, and Black voters made up 4.5% of the electorate. And so when we look at age demographics, the disparities are just as stark, where we see that older voters, 65 plus, participated at 40.1%, and young voters ages 18 to 29 had the lowest turnout at 8.8%. And so it's important for us to ground ourselves and remind ourselves that these numbers are not just statistics, but they really tell a story as to who is heard in our democracy and who is not. But these problems don't just stop there. The disparities are magnified when we look at county level contests, where primary turnout is even lower, and who is elected is often decided by a much smaller, unrepresentative electorate. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest struggles that we have and obstacles that we have right now when it comes to fair representation is the way in which we elect county officials. Many California voters struggle to access clear, nonpartisan information about the county contest, and that makes it difficult for them to make informed decisions. And because county elections are often decided in low info, low turnout primaries, the final outcome is often determined by a small, unrepresentative fraction of the electorate. Just to provide more data on this, in 2022, nearly 90% of all county races that appeared on the primary ballot were decided outright, meaning that the voters never had the opportunity to provide their vote on the general election ballot. Even more so, a large number of these races were uncontested, meaning that there was no challenger. And this data comes from Sacramento State through the CETA data. And so these elections matter because we're talking about county boards of supervisors, we're talking about district attorneys, sheriffs, and other key offices that make decisions around public safety, education, housing, and much more. And so what can we do about these elections to make them more accessible and representative? That's where AB 868 comes in. Next slide, please. So AB 868 is a common sense reform that ensures that county level nonpartisan elections appear on the general election ballot, where historically more voters have participated. And so the bill works like this at a high level. If only 2 candidates file for a race, the primary is skipped and the election is held in the November general where turnout is higher. This reform aligns county elections with state election processes, making voting simpler and more consistent. And it also provides voters with a greater opportunity to weigh in on county elections and deciding their officials, which leads to a stronger, more democratic representation and accountability. And this will provide all candidates, whether an incumbent or a challenger, a fair opportunity to compete, ensuring that our leaders are chosen by the broadest and most diverse electorate possible. And we've seen this reform work in San Diego County, so let's look at that a bit more. Next slide, please. So San Diego County, their experience with AB 901 shows how transformative this reform can be. In 2017, AB 901 allowed San Diego County to amend its charter, ensuring that county elections were decided in the general election rather than in a low information, low turnout primary. Voters approved this change in 2018 through Measure D, and the results were striking. We saw higher voter turnout when it came to county elections. We saw greater electoral competitiveness. We also saw more representative outcomes, ensuring that elected officials reflect the entire electorate, not just a small group. And so some examples of this were in 2020, we saw with the Board of Supervisors for District 3, in the primary, one contestant had a lead of 20,000 votes. But in the general, we saw after more voters participated that a different candidate ended up winning, demonstrating how shifting elections to the November general gives voters more power. Even in cases where we do see incumbents ultimately winning in the general election, the races tend to be far more competitive, proving that this enhances democracy rather than distorting it. And so AB 868 is about fairness, it's about equity, it's about ensuring that every voter has a voice when it comes to electing their county officials. And by moving these critical elections to the general election, we expand voter participation opportunities, we increase transparency and competitiveness, and we have the opportunity to strengthen our democracy. My last point here is just a call to action. We do need your support. We ask that you stay informed and that you follow updates on AB 868, whether that's through joining California Common Causes, CauseNets, or the League's method of communication, or you could track the bill through LegInfo. We also ask that you engage with your lawmakers and encourage your representatives to support this reform. And we also ask that you spread the word and educate others on why this type of reform could be beneficial for our democracy. At the end of the day, we're trying to make sure that California elections are more representative, more inclusive, and more democratic. So thank you.
Thank you, Jella. And we now move to Sky.
Thank you so much, Dora. Good evening, everybody. We've considered a lot of really important data, and I am sure many of you are considering how this resonates with you and the work that you do, the community that you live in. If you'll allow me, I'd like to share a little bit about what everyone's presentations have meant for me and my region and the organizing that we do in the Inland Empire. I want to just start by saying aloud that in almost every way, we have never truly recovered from the pandemic. Our communities went from being asked to participate in the 2020 census, paying attention in a highly contested primary election in March of 2020, A high-profile 2020 general election that saw the highest voter turnout that we've seen, and spent the majority of that year distancing themselves from nearly everyone around them and wearing a mask that prevented people from even seeing smiles on the faces of their neighbors. In 2021, we had redistricting all year round, with lots of education and advocacy, where we were calling folks to join us in that. We had a very high profile gubernatorial recall election that again asked Californians to turn out in high numbers for an election. And there was a brand new vaccine, and a lot of people had a lot of feelings about that. And we spent a lot of 2021 talking about that. As a sector, many of the nonprofits in California and each of my region, I speak for myself, took all of that work very, very seriously and folded all of that on top of organizing that they were already doing, to ensure that people were educated, informed, and active in all of the ways. So come the 2022 midterm election, our organizations were at capacity, our organizers were burnt out, our neighbors were fatigued, and that shows in the data. It's very logical if we pull back for a second and just think of all that we experienced. Turnout in the 2022 midterms was lower than turnout in even the previous midterms in 2018. When we think about our past election cycle, turnout by percentage was lower in both the primary and general election last year than in 2020 and in 2016. People were already in a cycle of losing faith in systems and losing social trust, getting radicalized by YouTube algorithms and social media algorithms. And we know that this voter depression cycle has consequences. We've been observing over the past several weeks the weakening and dismantling of our federal democratic institutions. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed and even helpless by everything that's happening. But I actually believe that there's a real opportunity that California has to lean into the leadership that we say that we have. We like to think of California as a place where we have a fully functional multiracial democracy, and we are leaders for the nation for what democracy can look like. And yet, we too have gaps that we can fill. So I think that we should lean into that leadership and say, this is a moment where we can continue to demonstrate to the rest of the country, to ourselves, that democracy works, that democracy thrives in California, and we should pass things like AB 868 to continue to grow upon that and model what true representative democracy can look like. I have a few slides that I want to share. If we can pull those up. I think now's just a good moment to look at a little bit of numbers, specifically, again, thinking about my region as an example. And for those who may not be familiar, when I say the Inland Empire of the IE, I'm talking specifically about San Bernardino and Riverside counties in Southern California. Building off of what was shared before, specifically by Jayla, the differences between a primary electorate and a general electorate are actually not marginal. As you can see on the screen, last year there was a nearly 40% difference in turnout in both San Bernardino and Riverside counties. In addition to that, in Riverside County specifically, just to get a little bit more narrow, and we can go to the next slide as well, 2 of our county supervisors were on the ballot, one in District 1 and one in District 3. In District 3, the incumbent won outright in the primary. There was 33% turnout in his district, and he won with 53% of the vote. In District 1, there was no incumbent. There was an open seat in the primary, and no single candidate won the majority, so there was a runoff in the general election. There were over 95,000 more votes cast in that general election than in the primary election. Further, the number 1 vote getter in that general election was actually not the same person who was the number 1 vote getter in the primary election. To add further context, in the previous election cycle in 2022, there were 3 supervisors that were on the ballot that year. 2 of them ran unopposed in the primary, thus winning outright, and never had to make a case to voters for why they should keep their seat because they didn't have a challenger and they didn't have a general election. Now, if I were those people, that would be rather convenient, recognizing how exorbitantly expensive campaigns have become. I'm empathetic to candidates that may prefer this system. As someone who also cares about democracy reform, I do believe that Citizens United should be overturned and that we should have public financing of our elections. We'll save that for a different Zoom. But that being said, what is most convenient is not always what's most democratic. Countywide officials have enormous power in the state of California. To stay with Riverside County, the most Riverside County budget established $9.6 billion in appropriations. 5 people can determine $10 billion of spending for 2.5 million people without needing to contend for their seat to a general electorate. And that is both problematic and undemocratic. Voters really deserve something like AB 868 to pass so that they have a real opportunity to be in dialogue with their representatives and vice versa. If we just go to my next slide. In true organizer fashion, I don't want to stop talking on this panel without offering some call to action. It's not being alarmist to be alarmed. There's a lot happening, and I know a lot of people are looking for ways to contribute, to feel empowered, and to do something in this moment. So my first suggestion for you all is to not give up on people. More than ever, we need community. We need to lean on each other. We need to support each other. We need to organize and educate each other. If we continue the process of distancing to the point of alienating ourselves and pulling away from people around us, we only become more vulnerable. So I want to encourage you to lean in. I also want to caution us to be careful about how we talk about what we're experiencing. We don't vote once every 4 years. We vote twice every 2 years, and sometimes in special elections. Picking up what was said earlier, voters are not apathetic or careless about government. Many voters have lost faith in government's ability to take care of them. The capital D Democrats did not just allow the continuing resolution to pass the other week. Of the 258 Democratic representatives in House and the Senate, 11 of them voted for the continuing resolution, right? Language has power. And I think now that more than ever, we really should take it upon ourselves to be really intentional about how we talk about what's happening. Because if we say aloud something that matches our vision, our values, our theory of what's happening in the world, we might feel a little differently and look a little differently at the people around us. And lastly, we have power, and we should lean into year-round organizing because democracy is a 365-day project. So I encourage you to stay in communication with your representatives. Call them, go to city council meetings, participate in local actions that speak to your values. You will feel better. You will feel more empowered. And in doing so, you will empower and make the people around you feel better as well. So with that, I'll pause and see if any of the questions are relevant, but just thank you all for allowing me to be part of this discussion.
Thank you, Skye, and thank you, everybody. I think that was terrific. We do have a lot of questions, some of which have been answered. So folks, check the answered column for some of the more sort of technical questions that we answered during the presentation. But Mindy, I'm actually going to ask you to sort of answer. There were several questions about data. And first of all, why is the data limited that you can work with and disparate? And also there's a question about what the difference is between registered voter turnout and eligible voters, and whether that has to do with the idea of conditional voter registration, which it really doesn't, but I'm going to let you answer that question.
I literally was just typing the answer to that
Okay.
second question.
I think everyone would benefit from it. So.
Yeah, no worries. It's just, it does not have to do with conditional voter registration or how you or when you vote. It's simply how registrars, the Secretary of State, researchers, others talk about turnout, how we measure turnout. There's two ways to measure turnout. One is registered voter turnout. The difference is your denominator. So is it the percentage of all those who are registered, right, that actually voted, 50%, 80%? Or do you use a bigger denominator? Instead of those that are just registered, you look at all those who are eligible to vote, right, adult citizens, whether they're registered or not, because that is an important way to measure turnout as well. Again, very commonly used for decades and decades. So that's a percentage of those who are adult citizens who actually turned out to vote. So Secretary of State will always, every election, show both measures. Nothing to do with how you vote. It's simply after the fact when we take this number of voters and what denominator we want to apply when we calculate turnout. And as I mentioned before, there are differences in when you may want to use one versus the other, particularly if you're looking at the question of disparities in turnout.
Thank you. There's a question here about what we're doing about civics education in our high schools and how critical it is that we all understand about why we vote, how it maintains our democracy, the power behind voting, you know, what voting can do for your community. And so from the league's perspective, I just wanted to mention that local leagues all around the state are very active in helping register and educate students in schools, especially high schools. And they frequently use a resource that we create at election time, the Easy Voter Guide, which has very plain language, readable, clear information about the mechanics of voting and various elements of elections that might be complicated, put into clear language. There's also bills that are right now in front of the legislature, and if Savannah reminds me, I'll include this in our email, that we are supporting, that will go further in making sure that high school kids are registered. There is a question down here, and now I don't know how to dismiss a question once I've answered it. There is a question about, I'm a college student from St. Mary's College of California. I'm trying to plan a workshop to mobilize my generation in campus. How should we go about helping Gen Z become more engaged for a stronger democracy? And I'd like to throw that out to some of the folks who work in the field, either maybe Pablo or Sky, to talk a little bit about how to engage our youth.
I'm going to volunteer Sky because she already answered this question, and I'm just going to repeat what she said. I think that I'd be curious to hear about her to expand, right? But we're talking about democracy. In Gen Z, what we hear is that I'm struggling with inflation. I can't find a place to live, to rent. I don't aspire to own a home because I don't think that I have what I need to be able to pay a down payment or to pay $500,000 to $600,000 for a cheap home where it is that I live, right? We're not listening in campaigns is my answer. And we need to start by asking what are the impacts, what are the issues impacting you? And then finish with what it is that we feel is the solution, right? We have so many candidates and campaigns, especially with political parties that show up only during the election cycle to say, I'm here to save and fix all of your problems. And I feel like that's a really big mistake, but I was trying to be brief and then I ended up talking way more than I should have, but I'll throw it to Sky.
I think that was great. And I appreciate the question. Power to you for wanting to empower fellow students and folks in your community. As you discover what works, also let us know, because it's a question that really depends on the person and there's always more to learn and gather. But I would say that fundamentally, I think that a lot of us pull away from government because we feel like it doesn't work, so we'd rather just take care of ourselves. But I think fundamentally, the problems that we face are too big to do on our own. We can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps to have healthcare. We can like there's so many things that government is required. We need government in order to fix education, to fix healthcare, um to fix job quality, to fix our housing, everything that we care about, climate change, everything that we care about and are important to us. There is someone in elected office that can make a decision about those things. And you can work as hard as you can, but if one policy is passed and millions of people's lives are then better for it, you have to lean into that process, right? Increasingly, things that we thought were nonpartisan before increasingly become more and more political, from education and social studies in schools, and everything that we can think of is becoming more and more quote unquote political and becoming a discussion happening in some sort of government space. So we lean into that, and just understand that that's a part of the process. The government is the prize, government is not the problem. And if the right people are in government deciding what happens to the rest of us, and we're in conversation with those people, then we can get to a place where it actually is working for us. So I would say that. And then I would also offer, which might answer a different question or two that we saw, is that doing education, even with Gen Z folks, about misinformation online can be really powerful. Um, there's some like deep fakes that young people are quick to catch. But also between ChatGPT, between the ease of social media, we're getting less and less good at citing our sources and not practicing a muscle of where did this come from? Who is the author here? What is their agenda? What are they trying to educate me around? The move away from media and more from everyone is media and good sources come from everywhere, put us in a position where we just accept some things at face value, and building a muscle to not accept everything at face value and practice follow-up questions and interrogating if something is true before just believing that it is, I think can be radicalizing it in and of itself, because then people can start questioning, why is someone trying to make me think this? And that might lead something in and of itself. So I think there's a couple different tactics, but happy to continue to be in discussion with you about how to talk to other young people.
Thank you, Sky. That was beautifully put. Pablo, do you feel like I see a note that you would like to answer the question about MPP voters, but I think you already addressed that, so it just somehow didn't get checked off, unless there's something else that you wanted to say.
No, I was trying to answer another question, but the only thing that I would add to this is I think that there needs to be an understanding, right, from organizations and candidates that there are way too many candidates that do only persuasion of likely voters, and they are not working non-election cycles to be able to earn, right? And so when I say earn is what I mean by listen, the votes of Gen Z voters and voters in general, right, that are like people of color. That is a really big problem. And I highlighted it with the congressional races where there's millions of dollars being raised and a very small portion going to field to do what we identify as a mobilization campaign, right? So that I think is a really big thing. Then for anybody that's a donor, everybody that volunteers on the campaign, I think that I would encourage you all to ask those folks in charge what percentage of your budget is actually going to field. Is this a persuasion campaign, or is it a campaign that also is engaging low and moderate propensity voters? And that will answer your question, because there's too many campaigns that are doing only persuasion.
And actually, I wanted to mention that the League has been leading a coalition, many of the folks right here in this coalition, to try to get funding for community-based organizations to do voter education outreach in their communities, to sort of work on both the value proposition of voting, spreading that word, and and the mechanics of voting, that we really have a problem with folks understanding. We have been working on this for years now. We unfortunately, we started in a year when we were flush with money in the state. Didn't manage to get it through at that point, and then very quickly came into our the budget problems that the state's been experiencing. But we have been working very hard to try to get at least a pilot program up and running where we fund community-based organizations to do this nonpartisan voter education and outreach in the communities, in partnership with county elections offices and with the Secretary of State's office. We think that because low propensity voters, people who are NPP, don't get that kind of outreach from campaigns, that they need outreach from nonpartisan organizations simply to spread the message about the value of voting for their communities, not necessarily the idea that it's a civic duty. That's not a message that resonates with people, but that it is a path to power, that there is an empowerment element to voting. And it is something that we will continue to work on. We have various ideas about how to pursue it and try to get some funding behind it, but it really is going to require a commitment by the state to understand that this underrepresentation that we've been talking about is a problem that the state has to deal with, that it is not something that the political parties are going to be able to make a dent in. So I just wanted to see if there's any other. I've been trying to follow the questions and make sure that we're answering most of them. Okay, let me know, Savannah, if there are things here that we should talk about. If not, I'd like to actually switch to the screen that I have to talk a little bit about a few other bills besides AB 86H, which is the primary bill that we wanted to talk about here today, that relate to some of the questions actually that have been asked and that relate to elections in general. So if you can throw that slide up for me and make it full screen, please. Thank you, because I'm afraid it might be too small. So there are a few bills here that I wanted to highlight for you, and we'll be sending out in that follow-up email fact sheets so that you can get more information about these bills. But we think that they help work to address the participation gap. There's SB 42, which is a Senator Umberg bill. It's the California Fair Elections Act. That's going to put a measure on if it succeeds in the legislature, on the 2026 ballot, the November ballot, allowing all local governments and the state the option to enact public campaign financing programs. Right now in California, only charter cities may do this, and the only way to get rid of the ban is to put it on the ballot. The idea here is that public financing combats the influence of money in politics. It gives power to ordinary voters. It reduces barriers to entry for running for office, and it diversifies the candidate pool. This one is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of California, California Clean Money, and Common Cause California. I also wanted to back up for a second on AB 868, that there's a broad coalition of folks who are involved in that, including everybody here today. It is sponsored by League of Women Voters, California Common Cause, Initiate Justice Action, and Initiate Justice, and Inland Empire United. There's also SB 266, which is a Senator Cervantes bill. It's called Our Freedom to Vote No Matter Our Language. What this one does is to expand language access support by requiring translated votable ballots, not just reference materials. And you may not realize this, but in many languages, only reference materials are available. One sort of laminated ballot for folks to look at and try to compare to an English ballot, as opposed to a ballot that is in their language that they can actually vote on. This is at the polling location. So we want to provide more votable ballots for more California language communities. So the bill addresses current gaps that leave a lot of language groups like Arabic, Armenian, and Somali speakers without sufficient voting support. And actually, pursuant to updated calculations required for the Secretary of State to do under this bill, 28 counties would be newly required to provide Spanish language ballots, and ballots in a Filipino language would be newly required in 23 counties. So it really does expand access here. That is sponsored by Asian Law Caucus, California Common Cause, and the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans. Now, those are two bills that we support. In fact, the first one, the SB 42, we are sponsoring. There is also a very, very bad bill in the legislature that is tied to and associated with some of the questions that folks were asking about this latest Trump executive order. It is a bill by Assemblymember Lee, AB 25. Actually, DeMayo, I'm sorry. It's Esley and DeMayo. And it is called the California Voter ID and Election Integrity Act of 2025. This bill restricts voting access through a variety of means. It's a long and complicated bill, including unnecessary voter identification requirements and the documentary proof of citizenship that you are seeing in this latest executive order that came out yesterday from President Trump, that we believe we know disproportionately impacts communities of color, older people, and people with disabilities, among others. This is opposed vociferously by the League of Women Voters of California and likely others in our coalition. It hasn't been referred for hearing yet, so folks have more time to get, the organizations have more time to get in their letters, so we're not quite sure everybody who's going to be opposing it yet, but it is ripe for opposition. Of course, the new executive order put out by the Trump administration would likewise require documentary proof of citizenship for registration, and it also poses an existential risk to voting rights. The League of Women Voters of the U.S. has issued this statement. I'm going to just read now from their statement, and we will provide it to you in a link in the follow-up email. This executive order is an assault on our republic and a dangerous attempt to silence American voters. The president continues to overstep his authority and to brazenly disregard settled law in this country. To be very clear, the League of Women Voters is prepared to fight back and defend our democracy. So we'll see what comes next. I'm sure there will be more substantive information coming from the League of Women Voters. We can get rid of that slide now. Yeah, this is our next big federal fight. It is a federal fight. We may need to respond at the state level. If this ever goes into, if it ever actually comes to pass, we're going to have ways of defending ourselves against it here at the state level, which may at some point include ensuring that people have access to free documentation that would allow them to show their citizenship on registration, free and easy. We're going to have to figure it out. And obviously, we're not at that point yet. I am hopeful that legislation will foil this really horrendous anti-democratic move. And I also just wanted, if I have a moment, and I don't know if we have more questions that have popped up, which I don't want to ignore. Okay, it doesn't look like it. I wanted to mention a few things that you could do that are sort of specific to some actions that you can take. Okay. First of all, if you're not a member of your local League of Women Voters, then go to LWVC.org and sign up. Local leagues can help by working in partnership with other community-based organizations on things like voter registration, voter outreach and engagement, public participation in local government meetings, right? That's very critical right now. And candidate forums that give direct access to candidates. I think the reason for working in conjunction with other community-based organizations is obvious from what we've been talking about here. We need to be working together to pierce through the representation problems that we are experiencing. The League does produce our easy voter guides in 5 languages. Those provide essential information for you to get out to your communities in advance of each statewide election in language. You can walk with them. You can do GeoTV with them. You can get them to your community-based organizations to walk with them as well. And when we need members to contact their state representatives to advocate for legislation like the passage of AB 868, we send action alerts. Those come at sort of critical conjunctures, critical points when the legislators need to hear from you. So please sign up for action alerts. Those messages coming from you really make a difference, and we'll send you the link to do that. And sometimes we do ask members in districts with legislators that we need to target to do in-district advocacy. So keep an eye out for those opportunities as well. They will come through your local league president. And we activate you for those purposes when it's really necessary. And those representatives take very seriously what their constituents are saying to them. So this is a very critical task. You can also apply to be a legislative analyst on our advocacy team. Again, we'll send you information about that. And lastly, if you are able to donate, please do so. The league works on a shoestring budget. I mean, the thinnest of shoestrings, and we need your help to support this work. So please do donate if you're able to. Did anyone else have any final words? Were there any final questions that we should really answer here?
I can speak a little bit. I can't speak that much to all of the high school related questions, but I will share for folks' awareness that Senator Eloise Gomez Reyes is authoring a bill this year, SB 316, called the High School Voter Registration Act. That will be an opportunity to add a little bit more teeth to existing law. Teenagers are 16 and 17 are able to pre-register to vote, but there's not a lot of teeth to like make sure that there's outreach and education about what it looks like to do that. And we know that if we vote early, we're more likely to become a lifelong voter. So if this were to pass and be signed into law, that would offer a little bit more teeth to not just allow young people to pre-register, but actually provide space for folks to get educated about what that looks like by the end of their junior year in high school. So if that is something that is near and dear to your heart and may not touch on all of the high school education questions, but I felt it was relevant and wanted to share that with you all.
Thank you, Sky. All right. Let's just make sure we haven't missed anybody's question. Bob Page. I'm going to read Bob Page because this is our Orange County Registrar of Voters. Presenters shared how a growing number of residents don't believe their vote matters and or don't trust institutions or government. Has research been done on whether there's a disconnect between what residents think their government does and what it actually does, and how to address that disconnect? It seems like it needs more than moving elections to November of even-numbered years.
I can start just so that I can be done speaking and then I can pass the colleagues. I would say yes and as opposed to or. I think that, on a day-to-day basis, many of us are engaged in mobilizing voters to participate in every election cycle. That being said, if the system stays as it is, then structurally we've designed systems to take advantage of people not participating sometimes of the year. So I think it is both that really important countywide officials should contend for their seats to a full general electorate, and we should do everything that we can so that people vote in every election possible. And that is what we do on a day-to-day basis. Pablo unmuted, he's going to share that they do the same, trying to do that civic education, that political education, that voter mobilization, so that people feel empowered, they're educated. I'll share a personal story, listening to family members, friends talk to each other and say, oh, I don't want to vote for governor because I have these stubborn potholes that haven't been filled in forever. And I'm just like crying inside, like, what do you mean, governor? That's a city council role. So yes, of course, there's lots of civic education necessary, but I don't think that negates the opportunity to improve the system that we have to make sure that it works better for everybody.
So I echo everything that Sky said, usually, as always. Sky very often can speak for me anytime. But what I would say is yes, and I am a product of Hillmore, California, which is an unincorporated community in the San Joaquin Valley in Merced County. We know very well what roles local governments play. I understand the question and the spirit behind the question, and I would say yes, there needs to be more of that education. However, I only have one supervisor that represented us growing up. And in the San Joaquin Valley, from Sacramento down to Kern County, there's 9 counties, 45 county board of supervisors. 35 of them, in spite of the reality that over 53% of this region are people of color, are white men that represent agribusiness developers or oil, right? And so the immediate answer often is told is like, well, your people need to do better about voting. But the election system is a really significant problem when the supervisors are the ones that we are then petitioning to represent Hillmar and the roads, the potholes that Sky is talking about, and that the money ends up going to Merced, which is like to us the big city in the county, even though Merced County is barely 100,000. I'm sorry, the city of Merced is barely 100,000 people. The health and human services, the day-to-days that impact us when we're organizing, we run up against the reality of supervisors saying, I'm kind of sympathetic to you, but you need to visit the other supervisors to get them on board. And so we get created extra work, right? And so when you, again, expand that to the reality that these elected officials, these supervisors are not elected, they're conservative, they're not elected to represent us, right? And then the things that it is that we need or that we believe that we need, right, in our neighborhoods to finish curbs, gutters, street signs, potholes, grocery stores, access to education, right? We end up, again, not being represented in a good way, right? 35 of the 45 are conservative white men, regardless of political party. There's only 4 women, right? And of those, there's 10 Latinos. I'm sorry, 10 Latinos. Again, 9 are men and only 1 is a woman. So there's a lot of reasons why the moving of the general elections, mandatory November general elections would be really important for the supervisors, county district attorney, and the county sheriffs, because they're the ones that are implementing and perpetuating a lot of these systems that we are struggling to overcome. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
I can add something, but I know you're short on time, so I'll leave it up to you, Dora.
No, please go. And
Okay.
people can log off if they need to.
I just to hi Bob, to answer Bob's question. I think it's great that he's here with us. As has already been noted, I think it's a yes but we do understand that there is a disconnect. There is data to show that people's level of awareness and how government functions, democratic norms more broadly, is low. And I think what might be helpful, a helpful way to think about this is, one, I think we need to still address the institutional changes, right? We need to make it easier for people to vote. As Dora noted at the outset of this webinar, we've done a lot over the last 10, 15 years in California to make elections and voting more accessible. But we still have additional work to be done, and that's the conversation around moving elections right to the general. That's part of that conversation. But we also have to make it easier, we have to make people want to vote. And that's the motivation question. That's not apathy. That is making people feel connected to the political process, making them feel like their vote actually matters. And I will say that I think it's also recognizing where people really are at. We can't say your vote matters because of your civic duty. That doesn't fly. And that doesn't fly across demographic groups, particularly historically underrepresented groups that have been marginalized, right? And see a lack of representation all around them. But that doesn't fly, period. More and more, I think we have a lot of data that tell us that Americans maybe still believe in the idea of democracy, but they don't feel democracy really works for them in terms of its outcomes. And when they think about democratic norms, their adherence to democratic norms really are conditional. Depends on if it's your guy or your party, right, in power. Then maybe you're okay with some subversion of democratic norms. Certainly more civics awareness of how government functions and what democratic norms are and why they're important would help. But there's a lot of frustration and a disconnect people feel about whether democracy is actually working for them in terms of its outcomes, tangible outcomes in people's lives. So they believe in the abstract of it, but have problems and concerns about how it actually functions in the US. And that goes all, we see that in whether people feel like their vote really matters, because why is this actually going to impact me? And then everything else that we talked about today in terms of how the system doesn't engage voters fully and equitably. But just to answer Bob's question there, I hope I'm answering it. Civic awareness is important, but I think we have to do it in a way that meets people where they're at, and we acknowledge the concerns people have around our democracy and how it functions. But we still talk about why, right, and how government functions in and of itself and why that is important. And ultimately work together to achieve better outcomes so people feel like it actually is working for them. And there's a whole host of other reforms like money in politics and such, right, that could actually, in very larger ways, right, also impact those outcomes for people and make people feel like their vote matters. It does matter now, but make people feel more connected to the process. Sorry, that wasn't that short, but
That was terrific. Does anyone else have anything that they want to say? I don't want to cut anybody off because everyone's got such great ideas to share. Well, then with that, I think we will end this. As I said, we will get you the recording, we will get you the slides, and we will provide you with other materials. Thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to continuing working in coalition and community with you all. Good night, everybody.
Have a good night, everybody.